Don't be evil, but the search result that you see when you type Jews is how Jews are evil. The result that you see when you're typing Holocaust in Jews is David Irving talking about how Jews being genocided and gassed in extermination camps was just a lie. That you don't even have to try that hard. When you type Islam, you find a range of hateful content waiting for you. On Team India, we tell you that it is time that we stop spreading hate in one of the most powerful platforms. We need to change that. What is our stance in today's debate? First, Google right now has incredibly racist and sexist, offensive content right now on its platform. It looks like how it looks like web pages talking about how Hitler is God and Hitler is hero. It looks like web pages talking about how to stalk women effectively online, how to keep your female dogs under control. It talks about how all people belonging to the Islamic religion are terrorists, are evil, and should be feared. We think Google should broadly be doing three things. First, it should change its algorithms and design it in ways such that the algorithm actively picks up racist and sexist content, things like Holocaust denial, where it flags out racist and sexist content and delists it from its platform. Second, when enough users are reporting on Google saying that there are particular search results that are racist and sexist, Google needs to use the human checkers that right now exist. So quality checkers that exist in Google who will look at this content and delist it from their platforms. Thirdly, when websites are being delisted, we think that appeals can be raised. So where appeals can be raised by these websites when they're being delisted. We will have a panel who decides whether or not that website A spread hateful speech and B had malicious intent to spread that hateful ideology. And if it met that criteria, we would delist it from their platform. Fourthly, notice that in the majority of cases, it is fairly clear what this racist and sexist and offensive content looks like. We agree that there might be some instances where there are cases on the edge that are not very clear, but that is no reason to have no control on hateful speech being spread rapidly in search engines. Notice that when we ban hate speech, for instance, and incitement of violence, we are not sort worrying about how someone just making a joke could be caught up in hate speech laws. We can restrict that. Obviously, that is not a reason to not have hate speech laws at all. Just because a couple of cases are intricate doesn't mean we allow racist and sexist content to run wild on the internet. Particularly when we know that Google already delists several web pages from its platform. Web pages that talk about how to make a bomb. Web pages that have gratuitous graphic violence in them. We know that Google delists them already. This is an extension of that. Three things in this speech. First, on why this meets the bar to delist content. Second, on why search engines have been elevating racist and sexist content that needs to stop. And third, why the comparative on our side is better. First, on why this meets the bar to delist content. There are two things that are inherent to the kind of sexist and racist content we see in Google. First, that it's incredibly hateful. So when you look at Islam in Google, the fact that you see a range of web pages talking about how all Islamic people are evil, that you need to fear them, that they're all terrorists. The web pages talking about how you need to fly kick sluts in their uteruses. The fact that you have web pages that talk about stalking women, we tell you that this is explicitly hateful in its nature. But second, that it has malicious intent. That this wasn't just accidentally sexist or racist, that it was intended to be sexist or racist, that it was designed in malicious ways to spread hatred and sexism. We tell you that this is incredibly hurtful to communities on the ground. But first, you have overwhelming stereotypes being spread about these communities, about how people interact with Black individuals and African Americans. And every time you search in Google, you have web pages talking about how all African Americans are threats to society. But it creates an atmosphere of violence, but it denigrates your very identity as a Jew when it's constantly perpetuating web pages of about how your history and your ancestry was a complete lie. We tell you that it creates an online atmosphere that is incredibly harmful to these communities. So Jews are constantly bombarded with hateful comments about their history. We tell you that is incredibly harmful. At the end of the day, this is content that we would never allow in the real world. The fact that right now we have hate speech laws across the world, we have censor board and film media actively regulating graphic violence, graphic scenes of rape in our society. The fact that social media pages like Facebook and Twitter actively regulate rape tests, actively regulate web pages that are incredibly offensive means that we tell you that this should also extend to search engines. With search engines shouldn't be an exception to this rule we apply in society where we tell each other that we cannot have hateful content spreading. But second, why mainstream search engines are responsible for elevating sexist and racist content on the internet. Before that, sure.
Madam, one of your criteria for delisting and refusing to list was malicious content. So if today someone posts an objective research paper proving how Muslims have a tendency to fall into violence, would you be okay with that?
Look, we did that. Yes, if there's a web page that talks about how all Muslims are likely to be violent, then we would love to have. Then you would obviously delist that on our side of the house. Second, then on why mainstream search engines are responsible for elevating racist and sexist content. Also, it would be nice if someone could put up a timer. Mine has stopped for some reason. A number of reasons how Google actively elevates racist and sexist content. First, that Google wants to make profits out of the kind of racist and sexist content that it creates, right? The fact that it wants to gain more and more people gaining access to its content, and that it actively prioritizes sensationalized content, that it prioritizes titles that are clickbaity in nature because it wants more and more people to access this content and gain more profits as a result. We tell you that means that you are likely to be diverse. Like even if you're someone who's just searching for benign content on search engines, you're likely to be pulled into more and more hateful content on the ground because of the fact that Google is actively prioritizing this kind of content on the internet. But second, the way in which search engine optimization works is that Google allows you to fund it in order to push your content upward. So people who are spreading hateful speech can say Google in order to get their content pushed upward, which means that racist speech constantly increases. Why is the comparative on our side significantly better? First, notice that Google knows how to flag racist or sexist content on our side of the house. That it can limit litigious violence and therefore can also limit litigious violence, and therefore on our side of the house it can also limit sexist and racist content, which reduces. But second, when Google delists sexist and racist content, lesser people are likely to access racist and sexist content. We've seen the fact in the past that when Google has delisted certain web pages, entire businesses have run out of their businesses, right? That is because of the fact that Google has immense amount of power to delist this content and ensure that people no longer have access to it. But thirdly, on our side of the house, instead of the first search result coming up as people who belong to Islamic religion are terrorists, we now have better conversations because these are no longer the kind of web pages that you're seeing, but instead you're seeing web pages on how women can be feminists as opposed to women need to be controlled. We tell you that kind of content is elevated on our side of the house. For those reasons, we propose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 23 seconds.
Can I just have 30 seconds? And that's cool.
The results. Arbitrary.
Okay. Judges, can I check that you are ready for me to welcome the next speaker?
Right, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Okay, may we now have the first speaker from the opposition to begin their speech?
All right, I am going to be starting in 3, 2, 1. I am unsure as to what search engines Team India is talking about. Because when you search about Islam, the first thing you don't listen to is that how all Muslims are terrorists. Because their characterization, the burden they're pushing upon us is one that is inherently extreme. We don't have to go on and defend neo-Nazi parties that have already banned groups that already function on the dark web. That is not our burden in this debate. They needed to be the more reasonable side and argue what is truly offensive content. People like Jordan Peterson, etc., who will never outright say Muslims are terrorists, but will try to bring more ideas as to perhaps how they could be. That is the sort of context that team proposition needs to argue. This debate is not about the extreme character they bring to you, no, the extreme characterization that they bring to you. But beyond that, what was their policy? They said that we're going to check for this offensive content. One, I want to point out that not all offensive content is objectively something that you can understand. So, for example, showing graphic images of how children within Gaza are being killed and how to generate human empathy for them could be offensive content to anybody. How do you judge that what is offensive in that particular scenario? But secondly, who gets to judge the offensive content? Algorithms created by web searchers or programmers within Google who are inherently white male people. How do you expect those people to then go on and regulate your content that you talk about? But finally, the idea of malicious intent. If malicious intent is something you want to solve, then how about you use courts? Because a firm cannot decide whether somebody had malicious intent. If anything, if your policy has somewhere on some level, we say it is not up to a search engine to decide who had malicious intent or not. It is up to a court of law. But finally, they had this really interesting characterization that Google wants racist content. No, Google does not earn money for the sort of content that's coming. The way content is prioritized on search engines is twofold. One, authenticity. Two, relevance. You don't give content just because you want to earn money. But secondly, Google doesn't earn money for racist content you push out. They simply earn money through multiple advertisements. Given that is the incentive structure of Google, their incentive is to have as many narratives as possible, which means even if you have offensive content, you will have content to counter that content as well. In that scenario, we say Team India's case does not stand. The rest of my rebuttals I'll be integrating in my positive case. What are the three substantive? First, how this undermines the freedom of speech. Two, how search engines provide essential counter narratives. And my second speaker will be talking about dissent within minority. But just before that, we say at opposition that if any need does exist, that if content is particularly harmful, we think we're reasonable. Therefore, we would say that any sort of content that incites violence, any sort of content that is hateful, like normal hate speech laws, we're completely fine in not going on with that. But secondly, we're also okay with having trigger warnings so people know this is particularly before they click on it. No, thank you. In that scenario, we say those are all existing alternatives that you have that can be implemented if a problem exists. What is the first line of argument then? How this undermines the freedom of speech? First idea, we think search engines are extremely important in the world that we live in. How most people access the vast majority of information from search engines, where debaters, we would know that. Why is this important? Because we think that as a search engine, you do not have the responsibility to dictate what people get to see and what people don't get to see. Then that's not okay. Why? Because look at the framing of offensive speech. Offensive speech isn't as black and white as they make it seem. Any sort of opinion that anybody disagrees with or does not like could be potentially offensive to me. If you tell me right now that Pakistan didn't deserve to win the Champions Trophy in 2017, I will be offended. Why? Offensive content is not as objective as they paint it out to be. Why is this framing then crucial? Because we say on their side of the house, what you have is state policing. That is to say, the point at which search engines are told that you need to block out offensive content is a vague term. States that have an incentive to crack down on dissent do that on their side of the house. And this is the vast majority of the world. Half the world is becoming more and more right-wing as we speak. We're talking about governments within Israel that don't want their Israeli citizens to see how Gaza is being annexed right now. We're talking about people within Viktor Orban within Hungary who does not want his public to see what they're doing to immigrants. We're talking about people within like Pakistan who don't want people to see what the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement is demanding for. You think what happens on their side of the house is the state uses this broad term fix and follow its own incentives and crack down on dissent. Why is this argument important? Because one, it covers the vast majority of governments, but two, it impacts the same minorities they talk about. Because these civil rights groups rally for them. On their side of the house, the state is able to crack down and make sure that dissent never exists, which means their stakeholder is not being catered to on their side of the house. Therefore, we feel that on their side of the house, states are able to use their writ and they're able to make sure that content that is being censored is one that they want to be censored. Before I move on to the second line of argument, go ahead.
Do you support Google regulating litigious violence in search engine platforms, or do you think that is also not something that is objective?
If any sort of content is actively inciting violence against a group, like in the status quo, if you have, for example, a religious extremist inciting violence against minorities, we think that sort of content we will, of course, regulate because it's completely unlawful. We're talking about content that is not as black and white as that. Again, I want to reiterate, this debate is not happening on the extremes that Team India is setting out for you. Second line of argument, how does it exacerbate the problems like sexism and racism? We say that search engines have one thing that is crucial: geography and outreach. Somebody sitting in Pakistan can know the problems happening 10,000 miles away, then they can understand because of the outreach that search engines have. Why is this crucial? Because we say on their side of the house, we think the problems they outline of racism and sexism are harmed on three levels. First, they create this illusion that the problem has been solved. Because the moment that you funnel out all racist content, the moment you don't allow people like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, and almost like every person who has somewhat offensive content, the moment you shove them out, you paint this rosy picture for the same group that you're talking about, that the world is fine, that there is no racism, that there is no sexism existing. So one, we think they create this illusion. But secondly, they create echo chambers on their side of the house. Because we think people who genuinely believe these things aren't as crazy as they make them seem. Often, most people don't just come out of prejudice. It's because they often believe these things. On their side of the house, these people will never ever be convinced that black people being inferior is not, is like a wrong thing to say. On their side of the house, these people will never be convinced. But secondly, note that on their side of the house, these people will go on to alternative forms of media, i.e. traditional media, which is far, far worse. Search engines, by virtue of being search engines, are neutral in the sense that they provide you all sorts of narratives. The moment these individuals with offensive content, racist or sexist content move to, let's say, traditional media, that is the point at which there is no regulation. Imagine all of this going on to Fox News. We say at that point in time, these problems they talk about are harmed more. How do we solve the problem? We give essential counter narratives. Because the point at which you have all sorts of racist content, etc., academics are able to publish research trying to convince these people that what they're saying is wrong. And note, this cannot happen on their side of the house. Because as soon as a racist person searches, are black people as inferior? All the search engine results they get on their side of the house are going to be biased, which means that that particular individual will never be swayed, which means the racist remains a racist. We on a comparative have the potential to make sure they let go of those biases that never happens on their side of the house. And we say ours is a model that is able to create activism and essential counter narratives. Team India is arguing this debate on extremes. We're the more reasonable side, and we tell you we protect the minorities they set out to protect. We're very proud of those.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 18 seconds.
Okay, judges, just let me know when I can welcome them. Okay, may we now have the second speaker from the proposition to begin their speech?
Am I audible? Am I clear? Cool. Yeah, I would also prefer my POSB signal. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Offensive content isn't as subjective or as gray as what side opposition wants to push. We say that Holocaust denial is explicitly hateful. We say that Holocaust content and denial is explicitly offensive. We say that web pages teaching men how to control their women is inherently offensive. On side proposition, we say we cannot continue to give a platform to websites that not only actively inciting violence, but are still actively attacking and denigrating the individuality of a human being. We cannot stand for a site that sits down, watches these websites, and does not do anything to deplatform them. 3 areas of response before I move into my argument in this today. First, I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to compare and contrast their stances, how they want to solve the problem that exists in the world. Secondly, we're going to talk about the obligations that search engines have. And lastly, we're going to talk about discussion. First, on their stance and how they wish to solve the problem. We pointed out that there exists a problem in today's world where racist content and sexist content doesn't even need to be highly objective offensive, but things which are explicitly racist and sexist, things that do things like call Mexicans racist, that say African Americans are a threat to society, are things that exist on search engines right now, are things which are actively given a platform and actively promoted in the way that you search for your views. We give you structural reasons as to why this happens through our first speech. Because of the way the algorithm works, because it is the sensationalist news that gets more clicks, that gets the advertisements on Google to be viewed more. Because of the fact that these are clickbait articles that ensure that Google Google pushes it up. But also because we actively told you that a lot of times these are websites that employ things like search engine optimization, where they literally pay Google to push their results up on the search engine. What that essentially means is that we pointed out a problem. We pointed out that there exists massive content that is offensive on the World Wide Web on search engines right now. Opposition's solution to this is doing nothing. They say we'll take them to court, but what that essentially means is that they concede that this content exists, but they want to do nothing about actively preventing it from being exposed to minorities. To wait until someone rich enough to take them to court finally does, until they solve the issue that we pointed out and they agreed with. But secondly, then let's talk about obligations. In their first POI, they said that these are platforms that have the obligation to put information up regardless of what it is. Crucially, we say that isn't really the case. If there is an academic paper by David Irving saying that Jewish people actually lied about the Holocaust, we don't think it's fair for us to keep that up there. Just because something isn't an incitement to violence doesn't mean that it hasn't attacked their individuality and denigrated what they are as human beings. When you feel extremely offended, that's the point at which we think these are things which attack you and ensure, and these are things which search engines have a unique obligation to ensure don't continue to have a platform. And we pointed this out when we told you that search engines are actively benefited by this. When they're paid to literally push these up, when the algorithm forces people to become more and more right, it forces them into more and more conservative ways, that's the point at which we think search engines are actively promoting it. But even if they aren't actively promoting it, recognize that our argument still stands. Because we said, as someone who diffuses information into society, it is your duty, regardless of whether or not you promote it, to ensure that the information you're diffusing isn't offensive, isn't sexist, isn't racist. Crucially, we dealt with that. Even in their best case, we won this clash. But secondly, then let's talk about the platform and what that has to and what happens to discussion. Opposition essentially says here that we create echo chambers, that we ensure that people move into closer discussion. If people are actively seeking out individual links because that's the only way they can access this information now, we say these aren't really the people to be convinced by a couple of more liberal articles that they see on the search engine. Anyway, the people we do think can be convinced are the moderates who come into contact with your offensive and racist articles. So if you just wanted to weigh that argument out in the debate, we crucially prevent a large number of people from becoming offensive, from becoming racist and sexist, while they are just afraid that a few more people will continue to be the way that they are, maybe a little more extreme on the ground. But lastly, I'm just going to take out their argument on states abusing the power with one line. If they wanted to listen to our model for even a second, the state is nowhere near the person who's arguing this, who is ensuring that this information diffuses. We'd love to have an independent panel led by Google, led by Bing, ensure that the state just can't abuse it. That point made absolutely no sense. Before I move on to my argument, I'll take a few.
In order to ban offensive speech, would you also disallow right-wing parties to contest in elections?
Okay, look, this isn't a debate between the right and the left, because the right can continue to be the right, continue to be conservative without being explicitly offensive. But if they are being offensive, if they are calling groups, if they are being explicitly racist, explicitly sexist, doing things that attack individuals, we'd be more than happy to ban them if that was the case. As we see in Germany with races like the neo-Nazi party, we'd be more than happy to do those kind of things on the ground. We take action to prevent that this happens. You can't pretend to solve the problem, especially when your only mechanism for change is either taking them to court or hoping that these people read a few more liberal articles and maybe become left wing. But let's move on to my argument then on how this is specifically something Google should do because of its user base. Broadly, we recognize that there are two types of users. First, moderate users who aren't actively searching out this content, who are pushed towards this content for the list of reasons that my first speaker gave you. Because of the way the algorithms work, because of the search engine optimizations that these websites employ, because Google is actively profiting from this racist content. But specifically, who are the individuals most likely to come into contact? We think these look like children. Children who, unlike platforms like Facebook and Twitter, there isn't as an age restriction on the ground for Google. Children, because Google's platform is one from the age of 5 to 75. What that essentially means is that when they're typing in things like Jews are, the first autocorrect that you see is Jews are liars. You type in African Americans are, the first autocorrect that you see is African Americans are hateful. What that essentially means is that they're far more likely to click on this content when that is given a platform on the ground. Why is that so harmful? It's because parents can't really control what their children are seeing. Because regardless of what happens, a lot of times they come into this contact in very extremely harmless ways. That if they were searching it up for like a school project, what that essentially means is that they do two things. For a child who is researching their own past, their own history, they see the host of articles calling them liars, calling them animals, denigrating their very existence, attacking who they are as individuals. But secondly, for children who are forming their view of the world, those are also children you change the minds of. Google has a unique power in being able to ensure that we have a positive outlook on the world. Instead they actively make it worse at the point in which they continue to platform and continue to promote this racist content. But the second type of users are the people who put content out on the ground on the first place. When these are individuals whose incentives either change because they no longer have the incentive to use clickbaity titles to attract viewership to their websites because it's no longer given a platform on Google, or even if they move into deeper, darker corners of the web, that's when we think it's far less likely that moderate individuals and children come into contact with it. We were the only side that recognized the real harm that this content has on individuals. We aren't as extreme as what side opposition wanted to characterize. We were the side that said Google needs to live up to its slogan to do no evil, to deplatform that evil.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 17 seconds.
Just let me know when I can welcome the next speaker. May we now have the second speaker from the opposition to begin the speech.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
We'll start. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Team India can cry you a river, but they can't really win this debate because they aren't fulfilling their own endpoints, protecting minorities or stopping this. Because I'm willing to bet that the first instance when you search the things of how to kill yourself, the first search you get on Google is suicide prevention. The first instant you say search Islam on Google, the first thing you get is history of Islam on Wikipedia. The first time you see the word black or African American on Google by relevant sorting, the first thing you get is how the Black Lives Matter movement is extremely important and doing milestones in the African American movement. The first time you search are African Americans truly an inferior race, the first word you get is it's a biological myth. Because we already framed out how Google and search engines categorize their content on two major things that was completely strawman by team proposition. We said that on authenticity and relevance. Notice that by their own characterization, they have conceded that people who have racist ideologies and sexist rhetoric only do so to the play of word and emotional rhetoric. They have no backing. That is to say that on a comparative, organizations and social movements who generally do care about minorities, who generally do care about women, often have proper research and development to encourage them or give them better views. That is to say that the first instant you search women, you will get a Guardian or you will get an article from Guardian which proves how feminism is generally important, how the wage gap is real because of XYZ scientific research. That is not the kind of comparative you get on right-wing movement, which is why on the comparative, they're already being deprioritized in terms of Google and Firefox because that is how they get consumed by telling them we're going to give you authentic content that has been proven by scientific research. So on the comparative, we don't think of fulfilling the endpoint at all. But number two, I say, if we concede to this narrative, the only reason why this is happening right now is simply because, well, people and algorithms have incentive to make money. I don't see why, after passing this policy, Google will no longer have an incentive to make money, which automatically means the same people who are designing these racist algorithms will continue to design them because you said we're not going to have state intervention. But number two, you need to have state intervention by your own metrics, because strong and my second proposition, because you simply cannot have people or government decide what abusive or what's offensive. It matters from country to country. So for example, saying I'm an atheist in Pakistan might be offensive to the vast majority of people in Pakistan, but it might not be offensive in USA. That means that the very virtue of offensive being said a broad term mandatorily requires state intervention. What does state intervention look like? This looks like the government of India deciding to tell people that, oh, everything in Kashmir is bloody fine, simply because it's racist to go against Indian nationalism within political posts or speak up for Kashmiris. That automatically means that you are not giving complete control of the space to do whatever they want to do. But we told you on a comparative, why is our liberal movement likely to succeed even more? Because Shreya explicitly said that the vast majority of cases, moral panic creates vigor, which incentivizes people to come up and speak about the issues and defend them. Case in point, however, the government decided that the George Floyd brutality murder should not have been seen on media simply because it's too offensive to people who are African American. The Black Lives Matter movement would have never been as successful because the moral panic would have never been as great. These kind of people, these racist sexist individuals who are the scum of the earth, when they come up and make a post, that is when we as liberals are incentivized to rebut them, to come up with logical facts, to do even better. And notice how on a comparative we win the moderates argument. Because we say moderates have a tendency to sway to either side, the right wing or the extremist side or the left wing liberal side. But in the vast majority of cases, they're a reasonable side. In our model, they are more likely to be seen, our voting is more likely to be seen as reasonable because the characteristics we gave you of the liberal movement, how they use facts and figures and genuine rhetoric and logic and not just rhetoric like in India, who do not buy the narrative. But number two, I say, in the vast majority of cases, when you had people like anti-vaxxers come up, that's the same incentive to conduct research to prove anti-vaccines wrong. That is the incentive to have research to prove how vaccines and comparative are better off for people. That's how you convince and prioritize people. So we say on the comparative, extremists, which is by the way one of their own stakeholders, are likely to be better off in the model because in their model they're never likely to visit the page in the first place because they realize that Google is biased, because they realize that Firefox only cares about the left wing. That automatically means that of our change is significantly mitigated when they see it as a biased side and an unreasonable side. Moderates will go to them. Why so? Because in the vast majority of cases, the extremist side will say, oh, look, they're taking away our freedom of speech simply because some minority out there is being hurt. That automatically means the moral high ground is now being given to the right wing or the extremist side, who is not seen as reasonable. Case in point, how Trump was literally elected because the left wing was becoming too restrictive of freedom of speech and freedom of autonomy, which is why people are okay with electing Trump because it was seen as a witch hunt. Before I move on, the smartest one, please.
Would minorities feel benefited if you don't ban a site that explicitly teaches individuals how to emotionally abuse a woman or a site that denies the Holocaust?
First of all, I don't know why it's the smartest POI, but number two, I say, in the vast majority of cases, if you search how to exploit women on Google, you don't find 7 reasons to exploit women on Google at the first page. You find 10 pages as to why women exploitations are bad by Guardian, by all those things by the Economist. But number two, I say, if that is literally your argument, that's still happening on traditional media, on social media, and all other platforms. Are you okay with banning them as well? If that is the case, you only want to have created an echo chamber of people who genuinely do believe that women are in fear. They're only going to talk amongst themselves. So people right now who are likely to search these kind of things are still likely to believe them because of their own socializations. That automatically means that you're going to have you're going to have an apolitical media house or apolitical Google. That automatically means they have no incentive to change because they're going to make their own echo chambers. You had to prove to us why people if not exposed to content on the internet still have a likelihood to change. We say socialization and other forms of real world experiences still exist. That automatically means that our world is the one that's trying to create virtual change through engagement that is not happening in team opposition model. And finally, the most vulnerable stakeholder in this case, right? The people or the minorities who are unable to speak up. The people in Palestine who are unable to speak up. We say we better protect them simply because in the vast majority of cases, the only way through which you can realize the form of oppression that's happening to them is when you see the oppression of Israelis. If Israelis are allowed to make nationalistic or jingoistic claims, is when you will realize that Israel is a very bad nation and treating Palestinians as very, very awful people. Similarly, when you allow people to make creatively sexist claims on Google, you realize that people in Pakistan or women in Pakistan and women in India, by the way, you're also responsible for this, are people who are actively being harmed and their voice is not being heard, will not be heard. So you ban right-wing agenda and right-wing movement. We are very proud of those. I'll give you other reasons as to why we think we clearly win this debate. I say I've lost the debate, but I remember the argument. I say in the vast majority of cases, people have an incentive to have that same within the feminist movement and all social movements as well. That is to say that even the feminist movement or women empowerment movement, we have different ideologies and different minds. Case in point, how a radical feminist might be offended by the views of a liberal feminist simply because she would realize she's not doing enough. Similarly, a choice-based feminist might be offended by someone who's a radical feminist or maybe a liberal feminist because they might be seen as not doing enough. This automatically means the only ideology that is not considered to be offensive is the ideology where people are in the majority. That automatically means that you are restricting the choices of oppressed groups or minorities to cater to their own needs and see which model or which form of reparation is best for them. Because now a person who is more in line with liberal feminism cannot find any articles to support liberal feminism or tell her why it's important or tell her why it's good simply because radical feminism is a popular idea or a popular language. That automatically means you are further harming minorities because you're not giving them a choice to seek out their own future, to think that's best for them. We say on a comparative, then we win on principle, we're protecting people's right to freedom and healing, and we still think on a comparative alternatives of trigger warnings to severely mitigate all the harms of minorities being offended. We are clearly proud to oppose.
Speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 14 seconds.
Just we can welcome the next speaker. May we now have the third speaker from the proposition to begin their speech.
Am I audible and clear? I prefer if POS were signaled as well. Let's take a step back and look at their case for a second. In their first opposition, we needed these opinions everywhere. We needed people to know that the problem wasn't solved, that if these opinions were deprioritized or not openly available, right-wing people would feel as if Google was biased and would not engage with discussion on the site. In our second proposition, we pointed out how deeply harmful these messagings are, especially to women, especially to minorities. So by their second opposition, these were newspapers and these were opinions that were already deprioritized by an algorithm that labeled them irrelevant and unauthentic. They were 10 pages down, but apparently still didn't create an echo chamber. At that point, we realized why they wanted to deprioritize. We realized why they wanted to move it to the 50th page and claim that that was the only place that was the only place that could be found. Because they really wanted to be on our side of the house where less people saw these articles. 3 questions then in this speech. Firstly, is there a principled obligation for search engines to delist offensive content? Secondly, what is the effect on the viewership of these articles? And secondly, what is the effect on people who write these articles? On the first question, is there a principled obligation for search engines to take down offensive content? The main claim we get from side proposition is simply, this does not meet the bar. We don't really know what this looks like. And they really don't, right? Because in their first speech, they want to say this looks like children in Gaza suffering, and that is somehow offensive to someone, or like my first speaker told you, targeted malice at a group, explicitly spreading stereotypes. But in their second speaker, it becomes apparently that the liberal feminist movement is going around telling other feminists that they are offensive and they should be taken down. What did we tell you this looks like? We told you this was explicit calls to violence. If they weren't explicit calls to violence, they were calls and instructions on how to invade a woman's privacy. In their best case, if these were just slightly offensive content and actually not actually direct calls to violence, these were things that perpetuated stereotypes. We told you African Americans were threats. It created the atmosphere necessary for violence by entrenching more violent ideologies. At that point, we told you it was necessary for us to take down these racist, sexist, and offensive ideologies. In response to this, in their second speech became, but these ideologies are already on the 50th page. They're already on the 10th page. Why delist them anyway? Notice how deeply harmful this is to the rest of their case about discussion and these ideologies being in the open. But we never go around asking libraries, don't take out an terrorist manifesto that you might have. Don't take out deeply offensive books. We don't tell newspapers, just move your racist content to the last page. We tell them to take it down because they have an obligation to ensure that no one views this sort of content and no one believes that content is legitimate. So at the end of the day, we realized there may be content on the edges. We realized that there may be content that was a bit more intricate. But we realized that it isn't a justification to just say we're not going to have hate speech laws anymore. We realized it was a justification to crack down on the most explicit cases and then make sure that we consider the more implicit ones because they could be harmful as well. The second thing we told you is that Google has a direct obligation to do this. They're either actively promoting this through racist algorithms like we've seen time and time again. When people searched up gender fluid in the last year on Google, they got images of a deeply harmful and transphobic meal. If they weren't actively promoting it through algorithms, they were profiting off of it. Every single page that is listed on Google gets an ad revenue. At that point, we told you that was completely illegitimate. Lastly, as a purveyor of information, just like newspapers, just like libraries, they had the obligation to ensure that this sort of content was not being seen by a wide amount of people and not being listed on their search. The only thing we heard from them was, this is just not true. If it was not true and it was already on the 50th page, we see no reason why they're against our cause. But I've never heard of this algorithm before. I would much prefer it if Google stopped listing search engines that told people that women were inherently dumber in the guise of research articles, or told people how to stalk women and how to invade on their privacy. Before I move on to what happens to the viewership of these articles, I'll take a PR.
Your characterization of Google was, if you search Islam, the only thing you're going to get are bad narratives on it. We characterize that a mixture of good and bad, where discourse and engagement can still happen. Prove to us how your model still applies in our model, where you can have actually ban or refuse to click websites that are harmful or offensive to you.
I just want to point out, before I respond to what our comparative is, that their stance has slid back from this is on the 50th page to this is back on the first page, mixing in with a healthy amount of articles. Our stance on this is that right now, Google's algorithms, like we've seen in the past, artificially inflate demand for these sites. Even if they don't, we're more than happy for these sites to die a slow and painful death, and I'll prove to you why this actually leads to better benefits on our side. The first thing we told you, under the fact that this leads to less viewership of these articles, was that less people inadvertently and by mistake come across on them, that they were suggested to less people when they look up something online. Their only response to it, that is crucially, in our second speaker, that went completely unresponded to, children who cannot be monitored come across as online and gain their beliefs off of that. The only thing they gave us on their side of the house was that, oh no, this goes into echo chambers. Again, not a justification we use in today's world to say hate speech might go into echo chambers, let's now publicize it to everyone else. But we recognize that there are some people who will always believe it. I'll show you how discussion gets better in just a moment. But if we grant that some people will always believe it, the far more important impact that we get on our side of the house is that these views don't become normalized. The more people don't see them and don't consider them, that they don't shift the overturned window. Crucial analysis we provide try to do in our first speech to be more extreme, allowing less extreme ideologies to also come up, making it normalized for people in Germany to say refugees are monkeys, or they shouldn't be, that we should incite violence against them, or they're ruining our culture. And secondly, the response they then relied on down the bench was that minorities will take care. These feminist movements will take care of it themselves. They'll be able to criticize it. And their first speech just was, we don't have an obligation to do it. Let them just hire an attorney and go to court. The first thing under this was that governments were apparently banning these minorities from speaking on our side. Remember, if China wanted to do this, and we're talking about authoritarian nations, they're already doing it. Otherwise, for democratic nations like India, like the USA, they're trying to ban George Floyd's images from coming up. There's significant pushback both to those countries and both to Google's. This is just not a realistic estimation of what's going to happen with this policy. What do we tell you what happened to minority groups in our side of the house? We told you that they would feel far safer expressing their views, that it's less of a far safer expressing their views, that they now don't receive hate and they don't see oppression every time they open up a website, that their views become prioritized instead of, in their best case, a mixed model of both views coming up. At that point, we thought that if every single time people opened up these websites and saw research papers that were proving them wrong, the vast majority of people, as they tell you, being moderates, we would decide that actually convince people to fall on our side. The last thing about you was that this is a problem solved. You give people a problem solved mentality. The first response to that is that taking away messaging of violence on the internet does not actually make people believe it, as violence doesn't occur in our side. Taking away explicit instructions and glorifications of conducting domestic violence don't make feminist organizations or the general public go, wait, that's not a problem. But secondly, these minority groups are seeing these problems everywhere. They reflect on the ground all around us. They don't even see it additionally in the internet to be reminded of the oppression. Lastly, and most crucially, what happens to the creation of these articles? In our second speech, we gave you an entire argument about how most of these people who create articles and then propagate them online are benefited by profit. This is so crucial to the debate, because if they wanted to have the case that people if they wanted to have the case of all their arguments just being about people are still going to access them, remember what crucially happens on our side of the house. That it's not just people who don't come looking out for these articles anymore, but the creation of these articles themselves far lessens at the point at which people don't have an incentive. Google has a principled obligation to make sure that women are not unsafe and targeted on their sites. We're very proud to propose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 15 seconds.
Judges, just let me know when I can welcome the next speaker. Okay, may we now have the third speaker from the opposition to begin their speech.
Hi, am I audible? All right, great. Just a second, let me put on my timer. Okay. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. I have 2 suggestions for Team India before I move on to what this debate is really about. A, they really need to update whatever search engine they're using, because I don't even know how they've characterized it. And secondly, they really also need to update their debating, because notice how we argued this debate on a spectrum. We said we take you at your best and argue the extreme content that you're taking about, women and how they deserve to be oppressed and how the Jews and the Holocaust was legitimate. We took that extreme content and we said usually that form of extreme content comes at the 10th or 11th or 50th page, however you want to straw man it. It's not on the first. What content comes on the first page? And that's what we said this debate is about, because that is the most relevant content. No one goes to the 10th or 11th page of Google. We think this debate is about what content actually shows up. So if you search up anything like Black Lives Matter, the 11th or the 12th result or 7th, 8th result might be Jordan Peterson's views on it, or Trump's views on it, or the fact that Trump has been assaulting women, or the fact that the Me Too movement has gotten too far, or sexist or offensive memes, or anything of the sort, or something that might be offensive to how the Black Lives Matter movement has been progressing today, or something like that is the type of content that you see in status quo on the first page that people are likely to access. That is what this debate is about. They can't argue it on the extreme. But notice how we took them at their best and we said, sure, let's talk about this content as well. And let's talk about the types of content we are. We didn't argue this debate on our best. We took them at their best as well. And we argued it in the real world, where we said that because it's not just the internet that is racist, it is society that is racist. We think you're not solving the problem. 2 questions and then I'll be answering. Firstly, how well are minorities protected when you ban this content? And secondly, do we think that Google or other search engines should do so? On the first question, first I want to really just analyze minorities. They said this delegitimizes a minority's existence. You feel so unsafe. But panel, notice the world that we live in. How are minorities treated outside of the internet? Do they not know of racism? Do they not know of the treatment and the way people think about them? What then was the benefit that we told you the internet gives you? It gives you a support group. It gives you international support, local support that you cannot find when you are just one person versus 7 racists in your school while they are telling you that you do not deserve to live. We think that is the type of support that we give you on the internet, because even when you have an individual posting something that is racist, there are 8 other people there to say, we are with you. This person is wrong. We support you. That support is an exclusive benefit that you get on the internet that is triggered by racist content or sexist content. We think that less people will offer that when you make the internet something that is apolitical or something where you don't need to voice these opinions. Secondly, power and accountability. On the internet, you feel like you are powerful enough to say something because you're behind this veil of anonymity in a lot of instances that you can't say to your husband who might be a wife beater at home and might say sexist things to you, or your teacher who might say something that really offends you at the end. We think that type of power is where you can be in control. You can call out that person and say, no, you are wrong. Just imagine the benefit that this gives to a person who's been systemically oppressed for so long, the type of voice that you provide to them, the type of opinions that they can finally let out against someone who is problematic. That is the type of benefit that we stood on. That is the exclusivity of the internet that we told you countless times. But thirdly, it serves as a trigger. And they try to co-opt this benefit, but they can't, because at the point at which they ban racist content, at that point, George Floyd's video of him being choked on the ground is something that counts as racist content. At that point in time, the trigger that you need, the trigger that the Me Too movement needed, the trigger that people need to think, things have gotten too far. We need to change now. That trigger goes down because it's an accumulative trigger. You constantly see people saying bad stuff on the internet, and that is what all it combines to accumulate you. We think these are vast benefits, exclusive benefits that the internet provides to you, never properly engaged with. We think we empower minorities the way side proposition can only dream of doing. Secondly, then, on people who are racist, here they said, and I'm going to take them at their best and talk about objectively racist content that makes people even more racist. The harm that they wish to tap into was contingent upon people having access to racist content. The point at which they said society is just as racist, it takes away from that harm. Why? Because then you are having the same conversations about how women are, objects with your locker room friends. You're having the same conversation with your friends. You're having the same conversation or looking at the same data when Fox News is saying something to you, and you're like, yeah, but what is the harm then? We say it's worse when you take it away from the internet. Why so? A couple of reasons. A, you don't have activists, minorities, allies, everyone there standing up to those people. In that locker room conversation, it's you and the guys, and you don't want to be the killjoy in that situation. Secondly, it makes them angrier because it only legitimizes the concerns of the alt-right. Hey, the liberals, they're just scared of us, man. They really think what we're saying is true. That's why they don't want to engage with us. That's why they're shutting us up. You had this stance when it came to minorities in the past, when you tried to shut them up regarding what their views were on immigration, and you saw the election of Trump literally a year after that. We think that is what happens when you shut opinions down. It is not that they go away. It is just that people stay silent at that point, but they continue to get angrier and angrier. And at that point in time, the next time a black person walks out of the bus, you're like, get out, because I don't want to look at you anymore, because your anger is validated. It is justified at the point at which we think such an extreme stance is taken by the liberals. Thirdly, there is no discourse. This is important because the only way things can change, your opinion can change, regardless of who you are, is when someone gives you a fact that makes it appealing enough for you to change your opinion. Notice how simply on probability we think this is greater in our world. Because who's going to call Fox News out when you're sitting in front of the telly with like popcorn in your hand and no one's there around you? We think just having that broadness of opinion in our world is something that we think can sway you or redirect you towards opinions that have the potential to sway you. That engagement is something that doesn't come on your side. We think we win on discourse. We win on how we can change these opinions. Fourth, It is blinding the problem. At this point in time, when you eradicate sexist, racist opinions from the internet, people think society is perfect. At that point in time, the Black Lives Matter movement does not, even though it has the capacity, does not know what things it needs to tap into to make sure that it's solving the problem of racism within a particular area. Because on the internet is when opinions can reign free and you have a pool of all of them never responded to. Fifth, the convincing power of the internet goes down. At the point at which the internet is just a zone for liberals, all of the great content they wanted to tap into goes down, or its values goes down in the eyes of a conservative, because then they think the internet's just a sphere for liberals. Oh my God, this is just their agenda. I don't want to even listen to this. We think that is extremely harmful because legitimate research then goes down and reduces in value. We think even if you had the likelihood of clicking on the first or second search results, then it doesn't happen within their world. What does all of this mean? It means people who are about to be swayed no longer see all the articles as reasonable anymore. We think that your conservative opinions do not become addressed. We think society generally becomes worse for minorities, more hate crimes. That is when more people are targeted, but the most vulnerable are targeted even more. But also funds for news agencies such as Fox News, etc., or other conservative think tanks that have other ways of reaching out to you increase. Because now your funds don't need to be diversified. They can just go to one or two that will continuously fuel that racist rhetoric and racist thought even more. What have I done for you within this issue? I've shown you how we harm more people, more vulnerable people, but I've also co-opted their stakeholder and shown you how society is much worse for them, how they're not empowering them, how they're only fueling racist rhetoric. Second question, then, should the government do this? Our first speaker said here that the validity of rights is something that needs to be protected. You need to value them. Because at the point at which a government or an organization says that speech and dissent is something that can be tapped into, at that point in time, Pakistan can take away from blasphemy, from blasphemous claims on the internet. Or India can, for example, shut out any views about Muslims being oppressed, etc., or minorities that are left out. We think you give your government authority that we don't want to see. We don't want to set this precedent. It is too scary because 10 years into the future, we don't know how this power is going to be manipulated. For all of those reasons, I say optics is
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes, 15 seconds.
Judges, just let me know. Okay, may we now have the reply speaker from the opposition to close their case?
Am I audible? All right, I'll assume I'm audible. Starting in 3, 2, 1. What was Team India's characterization today? At first proposition and throughout the bench deputy, they said that, oh look, governments, peoples, and organizations, to be frank, are really, really racist. The instant you search Islam on Google, the first 10 articles you're going to get is how all Muslims are racist. Instant you search African American, you're going to get the first 10 articles going to be how they're all extremely inferior. Given that characterization of how extremism and racism and sexism is rampant in the society, we don't realize how they're really protecting minorities, because we don't think people are virtual hermits. They actually go out and move out of society and interact with people. That means that your harms of protecting minorities is extremely minimalistic, given that you've already given your alternatives on how you can have bigger warnings and allow people to ban websites that they are comfortable with. But the issue is that if people are so extremist right now, and now they're going to tell them, oh, look, we don't agree with your views, we don't think you're good enough, and we think minorities are more important, hence we're going to ban you from the internet. Imagine how much more extremist they would become. Imagine the amount of hate you would have on all minorities. So not even only taking away their jobs, i.e. USA, but also taking away their voice. If that is your characterization of the world, then we don't think in any worldly proposition can ever win. Why is then our moderate approach and our more reasonable approach better off? Because we give you exclusive benefits of having engagement on the internet. Number one, we said if your idea is having no engagement on the internet because that it's too problematic for you, that kind of media narrative will still exist in Fox News and all the opportunities that you have created by your own culture or by your own culture. But number two, you're having the added harm of being seen as unreasonable because you're taking away people's voices. That automatically means that the moderates that you are so concerned about, who like to see the reasonable side, are likely to go towards the right or the extremist side because they're not the ones who are curtailing your rights, it's us who is doing so. But number two, we said that in the vast majority of cases, these extremist ideologies, they don't have to be extreme as in kill all African Americans, even think that the Black Lives Matter movement isn't as important or the Me Too movement isn't as important, incentivizes social activists to do better, to make an extra effort, to put more investment and put more funds into research because you realize exactly what the target market is thinking, exactly what those racist people are thinking. That is when you have an incentive to counter their claims. That is when you have an incentive to appeal to the models. And that is when you have an incentive to stand up to the little guy who in your racist world is not getting any support because there is no other consent. Because even at our worst, we can see that the vulnerable people are unable to voice up. At least the perpetrators are being named and shamed by the Me Too movement, by the Black Lives Matter movement for making racist or oppressive claims. That automatically means that we give minorities more closure. We tell them we're out there for them, and we tell them there is hope. You're trying to convert. At best, team opposite team India's model is stagnant. But the second issue, that on principle, and notice how they completely strawman our argumentation as to why government intervention will be necessary for the model to work because the idea of offensive is too broad to have a general algorithm for people all over the world. Why is this problematic? Principally speaking, we already told you if you want to curtail the right of freedom of speech, it has to be proportional. That is why direct harms of violence are already curtailed to or catered to. But number two, I say you're only trying to incentivize harm even further when now the same oppressive states that have been negligent to things like racism, that have been negligent to things like sexism, are now in control. This looks like the government of Pakistan saying that supporting Ahmadis is now offensive. This looks like the government of India saying that supporting Muslims is now offensive, and you cannot do so at all. What does this mean for the same minority that you're trying to protect at the opposition model? They will never have a voice. Their voice will never be heard. Coupled with the fact you've already taken their voice away for so long, that automatically means that on a compare, if racism truly does exist, the model is not to shun it away and assume it never existed. The model is then to take it head on, clash with it, and tell people why we're the right ones. We're extremely proud to do this.
Speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 3 seconds.
Just let me know when I can welcome the next speaker. Okay, may we now have the reply speaker from the opposition to close their case.
This is audible. Three, two, one. Why do we always make minorities be forced to defend their existence, be forced to defend their identity, telling us that we're not terrorists, we're not threats, we're not rapists, which is just like you. Why do we always put them in that position rather than not putting them in a position where they have to defend themselves to begin with? Opposition's case was one where they wanted to say that minorities should get attacked both in the real world and in the internet just so that they can respond to these attacks that people have. That, oh no, people are racist. They need to be allowed to be all the raging racists out there. They need to be allowed to spread all the racism that they can just so that these racist people did not turn to something worse. We were far more clear. We needed to protect these minorities, and we shouldn't be forcing them to engage with racist views. We shouldn't be forcing them to defend themselves every single time and spreading this hatred online. Two questions then in this case. First, on is it justified for us to regulate sexist and racist views? And second, on spreading hatred. First, on sexist and racist ideology. Pakistan began this debate with a red herring when they said, we need to regulate views that are violent and that incite violence, but not views that are offensive or racist. We pushed them on this. Saying all black men are threats leads to violence on the ground. Saying that Jews are thieves, saying that Mexicans are rapists leads to violence on the ground. At which point, would they regulate all of that speech as well? And if they did, what happened to their principle of, we don't know what is offensive, therefore we shouldn't be regulating any speech? But the second thing that we told you was that we had a clear metric, right? That it should be hateful speech against particular vulnerable communities. And second, that there is a malicious intent to spread hatred. Controversial opinion, talking about the patriarchy, talking about how sexism affects you, talking about Black Lives Matter, isn't malicious intent, isn't spreading hateful ideology. It is, in fact, going against hateful ideology. So we told you that this was the bar that we set for ourselves, something that was clear right from first speech. But the third thing what we pointed to was that this was never an argument we would accept in any other aspect of life. That when regulating hate speech, we didn't tell ourselves that we don't know what is exactly hate speech, so let's just allow all the hatred in the world to exist, but rather that if there are gray lines, then our responsibility is to expand our understanding of what constitutes hate speech as opposed to allowing hatred to run wild on the internet. Ultimately, what you need to weigh in this debate is that even if we get some content on the gray line to be regulated on our side, the fact that the vast majority of racist and hateful content is regulated still provides a protection for those very minorities that they seem to care about. But second, let's talk about which side reduces the spread of hatred. We brought you quite clearly reasons why search engines like Google actively elevate racist and sexist content. Their response was, don't worry, right now it only exists in the 50th and the 11th pages. Nobody ever sees them according to their search speaker. That is a jarring concession that they just made. That they don't want these views to actually be seen by people on the ground. That they don't want these views to be heard by people on the ground. And that was our side, right? The fact that if you delist them from these platforms, there was no chance that people got to see these articles, see these web pages to begin with. At which point they told us, oh no, but this creates echo chambers, the discussions are really, really fun. But throughout their three speeches, it was still unclear why you needed to spread racism in order to have a discussion about racism, why you needed to spread hatred in order to have a discussion about feminism. We told you that you don't need to spread sexual hatred. You don't need to call Black people as threats in order to have discussions about racism. You could do that on either side of the house without being offensive and hateful to people. That ultimately, on our side, we had far better protections for minorities and had better discussions. For those reasons, we propose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 12 seconds.
Okay, thank you everyone for your most enjoyable debate. Can we ask everyone to wait patiently in this room as the judges deliberate? Judges will return to this room at the end of the deliberation to deliver the results. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
And that is a really good debate.
Thank you, guys.
Will we be moved automatically to the deliberation room, or should I text Tab to do us?
We have messaged